Clara Whitmore pressed her knuckles against her mouth to keep from screaming. The train was gone. The platform was empty. And the letter she had carried for 6 weeks, the letter she had staked her entire life on, was nothing but a lie folded into an envelope. She was alone. She was broke. And somewhere behind her, a whole town of strangers was watching her fall apart and choosing to do nothing about it. She had survived betrayal before, but not like this. Never like this. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Clara had been on that train for 4 days. 4 days of hard wooden seats of smoke drifting back through the windows of strangers pressed against her shoulders as she tried to hold herself together with nothing but willpower and a letter tucked inside her coat pocket. She had read that letter so many times, the fold lines had gone soft. She knew every word by heart. She knew the name at the bottom, a Mr. Gerald Putnam, chairman of the Red Hollow School Committee. She knew the salary he had promised. She knew the date she was expected to arrive. September the 4th, 1882. Today. She had planned everything. She had given up everything. And she had stepped off that train with her chin up and her small suitcase in her hand, ready to begin again. But Gerald Putnam was not on that platform. Nobody was on that platform. Clara stood very still for the first few minutes, the way a person does when they are certain they have simply made a small mistake. Looked at the wrong clock. Misread a direction, arrived at the wrong door. She checked the letter again. Red Hollow Depot. September the 4th. She looked up at the wooden sign above the station house. Red Hollow, Colorado Territory. She had the right place. She had the right day. Gerald Putnam just was not there. She waited 20 minutes, then 30, then an hour. The sun moved. The shadows stretched long. A dog wandered across the far end of the platform, looked at her once with total indifference, and wandered away again. Nobody came. After 90 minutes, she walked to the station agent's window. The man inside was older, heavyset, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. "Excuse me," Clara said. "I'm looking for a Mr. Gerald Putnam. He was supposed to meet me here today." The station agent looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Putnam," he said slowly, almost carefully. "Yes, he's on the Red Hollow School Committee. He wrote to me in Missouri, offering me a teaching position. I've come all this way to—" "Ma'am." The agent took off his glasses. "Gerald Putnam left Red Hollow 8 months ago, packed up his family and moved back east after the school closed." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry. The school." He said it patiently, like he was explaining something to a child. "Red Hollow Schoolhouse closed last spring. Wasn't enough children enrolled to keep it running. The whole committee dissolved." Clara heard the words. She understood the words individually, each one perfectly clear and separate. But together, they made no sense. "He wrote to me," she said. "In February. He offered me a position beginning in September. He said, February." The agent nodded slowly. That letter would have been written right before everything fell apart. Things moved fast around here. Wouldn't be the first time somebody got a letter that was already outdated before it ever left the territory. Clara looked at him. "So there is no job?" "No, ma'am. And the school is closed. Has been since April." "And Mr. Putnam?" "Gone, months ago." She pressed her lips together. She would not cry in front of this man. She absolutely would not. "Is there anyone else on the committee I might speak with? Anyone who might—" "There is no committee, ma'am." His voice was not unkind, but it was final. "There's nothing left to speak to anyone about." She stepped back from the window. She stood in the middle of the platform, and she thought with a kind of distant, almost scientific calm. What do I have? 1 suitcase. Inside it, 2 dresses, a pair of boots that needed resoling her teaching certificate, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and $11.40. 1 photograph in her coat pocket. Her parents taken 12 years ago. Both gone now. 1 letter that was worthless. And nowhere to go. She had burned every bridge in Missouri to get here. She had left behind a teaching post that would have been hers to keep a room she rented in a decent boarding house, neighbors who at least knew her name. She had left all of it because of Thomas Hargrove. She had not let herself think about Thomas since the train pulled out of Jefferson City. She had made herself a promise on that platform she would not think about him until she was settled in Colorado, until she had a room and a job and a solid floor under her feet. But her feet were on the Red Hollow Depot platform and the floor was anything but solid. Thomas Hargrove. 31 years old. Junior partner at Hargrove & Sons Shipping. Handsome in the way that means a man has always been forgiven for things he should not have been forgiven for. They had courted for almost 2 years. She had expected a proposal. She had planned for it quietly the way women had to plan for things quietly, because to say them out loud felt like tempting fate. And then 4 months ago she had come home early from school on a Thursday afternoon and found Thomas in the parlor of the boarding house, holding the hand of Margaret Dryden, the daughter of the man who owned half the shipping contracts in Jefferson City. He hadn't even looked ashamed. That was the thing that had broken her in the end. Not the betrayal. Not Margaret Dryden's perfect white dress, or her family money, or the simple devastating logic of the situation. It was that Thomas had looked at Clara across that parlor with absolutely no shame on his face. Just a kind of tired patience, as though she were an inconvenience he had been expecting to deal with eventually. Clara, he had said in that reasonable voice she had once thought meant he was a reasonable man. I think you know this was never going to work out the way you hoped. She had not answered him. She had turned around, walked back to her room, and by Friday morning she had written to every school board within 1,000 miles, looking for a fresh start. Gerald Putnam's letter had arrived 6 weeks later, and she had called it a miracle. Now she stood on a platform in Colorado territory, and she thought, maybe I was wrong about miracles. A group of men came out of the station house and walked past her without looking at her. 2 women in bonnets crossed the far side of the platform, glanced in her direction, and then turned deliberately away. A boy of about 10 leaned against the station wall, eating a biscuit and staring at her with the unflinching honesty that only children allow themselves. She stared back at him. He chewed his biscuit. "You lost?" he asked. "No," she said. And then after a moment, "Yes, I don't know. My mama says a person can't be lost if they know their own name. Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am. My name's Jessie. What's yours?" "Clara." "Well then, Miss Clara." He finished the last of his biscuit and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Reckon you're not as lost as you think." And then he hopped off the wall and disappeared around the corner of the station house, and she was alone again. The sun was sinking. That was the thing that started to frighten her, not any of the facts she had learned in the last 2 hours, but the simple physical reality of the sun, dropping below the ridgeline, and the air turning cold, and the platform lamps being lit, one, by a boy with a long taper. She had no reservation at a hotel. She had not thought she would need one. She had not thought she would need any of this. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the end of the platform, and she stood there, and she looked out at the town of Red Hollow, spreading away from the depot in both directions. Wooden storefronts, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, a few houses set back from the main road with oil lamps burning in their windows, and she felt for the first time in her 26 years that she was entirely and completely invisible. Not small, not overlooked, invisible, like the kind of person the world had simply decided did not require its attention. Her mother had told her when Clara was 12 years old and crying over a cruel thing a schoolmate had said, "The world will not always be kind to you, Clara, but that is the world's failure, not yours. You stand up straight and you keep moving." She stood up straight now. It cost her more than she expected. She walked into the station house and asked the agent if he knew of a boarding house nearby. "Mrs. Aldridge keeps rooms," he said, "but she's usually full. You could try her." "And if she's full?" He shrugged, not unkindly, but helplessly. "Wouldn't know what to tell you, ma'am." She thanked him and walked out. She did not go to Mrs. Aldridge's immediately. Instead, she sat down on the bench at the end of the platform, set her suitcase between her feet so she could feel it against her ankles, and she pressed her hands flat against her knees. Think. She had always been good at thinking. It had been her best quality as a teacher. The ability to slow down when everything was moving too fast and ask the right question instead of panicking. All right. What was actually true right now? It was true she had no job. It was true she had $11.40. It was true she was alone in a town that did not know her and had not expected her. But it was also true that she was not sick. She was not injured. She was capable of working. She was educated. She had skills that were worth something. She was not helpless. She was frightened. There was no point in lying about that to herself, but she was not helpless. So, she would go to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. If there was a room, she would take it for a week while she figured out her next step. If there was no room, she would ask about the next train east and make a different decision. She was 26 years old. She had survived Thomas Hargrove. She could survive this. She picked up her suitcase, and then she heard a voice behind her. Are you waiting for someone, or are you waiting for a reason to leave? She turned around. The man standing at the far end of the platform was not particularly impressive to look at first. He was tall, but the kind of tall that doesn't announce itself. He wore a coat that had been good quality once and had been worked hard since. His hat was pushed back just enough that she could see his face clearly. Strong jaw, sun-darkened skin, dark eyes that were watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity. She was certain it wasn't pity. Not the blank turned-away indifference of everyone else on the platform. Something else. Something more like attention. Real attention, the kind that sees rather than just looks. "Excuse me," she said. "I heard you talking to the station agent," he said. He walked closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "About Putnam, about the school. Were you listening to a private conversation?" "Not intentionally. The window's open." He nodded toward the station house. "Hard not to hear." She straightened. "Then you know the situation is none of your concern." "Probably right about that." He didn't move to leave. "My name is Elias Boone. I own the Boone Ranch about 4 miles north of town. You said your name was Clara." "Miss Whitmore," she said. "And I don't see that my name is any of your business either." "No, it isn't." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he was not bothered by her sharpness at all, that he had expected it, or something like it, and found it entirely reasonable. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Whitmore. You can tell me to go to the devil if you want. That's completely your right." "Go ahead." He looked at her steadily. "My ranch keeps accounts. Ledgers, records, purchase orders, payroll, the whole mess of it. My last bookkeeper left for Denver 3 months ago, and I haven't found a replacement. A woman who's educated enough to hold a teaching certificate is educated enough to keep books." She stared at him. "I'm also aware that I'm a stranger, and that everything I just said could sound like exactly the kind of offer a woman alone should refuse immediately." He said this without defensiveness, like he was simply acknowledging a fact. "So I'm also going to tell you that Mrs. Aldridge, the boarding house on 2nd Street, will vouch for me if you ask her. As will the Reverend at First Methodist, and the Sheriff of Red Hollow, whose name is Bill Pryor, and who I have known since we were boys. You can walk into that town right now and ask any one of those 3 people if Elias Boone is a man who can be trusted, and they will tell you yes." Clara was quiet. She looked at him. He looked back at her, neither pressing nor retreating. "You're offering me work," she said. "I'm offering you a chance to stand again," he said. "Whether you take it or not is entirely up to you." She should have said no. Every reasonable instinct she had said no. She was in a strange town. I was a stranger. She did not know him, and the history of women alone, trusting men they did not know, was not a history she wanted to add a chapter to. "Why?" she asked. "Why offer this to someone you don't know?" Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but changing. Like a door opened slightly on a room he didn't usually let anyone see. "Because I know what it looks like when someone's fighting to stay upright," he said. "And I know how it feels to have nobody offer you a hand when you need one." She studied him. "I will go to Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "and to the Reverend, and if necessary to the sheriff." "I'd expect nothing less," he said, "and if they confirm what you say, then the offer stands. I won't be a charity case, Mr. Boone. I said I needed a bookkeeper, Miss Whitmore. That's honest work for honest pay. There's no charity in it." She looked at him for a long moment. The oil lamps on the platform were all lit now. The night was coming in fast and cold off the mountains. "What's the salary?" she asked. And something happened at the corner of his mouth that was almost not quite, but almost a smile. He told her the number. It was fair. More than fair, actually. More than she would have made at the school. "I'll go speak with Mrs. Aldridge," she said. "I'll be at the livery stable when you're ready." He touched the brim of his hat. "Take whatever time you need." He walked off the platform without looking back. She watched him go. Then she picked up her suitcase, lifted her chin, and walked into Red Hollow. Mrs. Aldridge was a small woman with sharp eyes and flour on her apron, who opened her door, looked Clara up and down in 2 seconds flat, and said, "You're the teacher that letter brought, aren't you? Lord child, come inside before you freeze." Clara stepped into the warmth and the smell of baked bread and said, "You knew about me. Gerald Putnam mentioned he'd written east for a teacher before he left." Mrs. Aldridge shook her head. "I always wondered if somebody would actually show up. Sat down and wrote you a letter myself to warn you, but I didn't have an address." She looked at Clara with something close to guilt. "I'm sorry, honey. I truly am. Come sit down." Clara sat at the kitchen table. She accepted the cup of tea that was pressed into her hands. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "do you know a man named Elias Boone?" The woman's expression shifted immediately. "Elias? Yes. Known him since he was 20 years old and first came to this valley. Why? He spoke with me at the depot, made me an offer of work." Mrs. Aldridge set down her own cup and looked at Clara very directly. "What kind of offer?" "Bookkeeping, for his ranch." The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elias Boone is the most honest man in this valley, Miss Whitmore. I say that and I mean it. He's worked that ranch alone since his wife passed 4 years ago, and I have never once heard anyone say a word against his character. Not one word." Clara nodded. "He also," Mrs. Aldridge continued more quietly, "was the man who sat up 3 nights straight with my husband when he was dying so that I could sleep. He didn't ask for thanks, and he didn't make a show of it. He just did it because it needed doing." Clara was quiet. "There it is," she said. "There it is." Mrs. Aldridge agreed. But when Clara was shown to a room small and plain and clean, with a patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, she closed the door and sat on the edge of the mattress, and she let herself feel for the first time all day how frightened she actually was. Not the controlled fear she had managed on the platform, the fear she could reason through and organize and present as calm. The real fear. The underneath fear. She was 26 years old, and she was alone in Colorado territory, and she had used up everything, her savings, her caution, her reserves of starting over, on a letter that had turned out to be a ghost. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She thought about her mother. She thought about the classroom in Jefferson City, where she had taught for 3 years, the faces of her students, the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something for the first time. She thought about Thomas Hargrove's face across the parlor, with no shame on it at all. And then she thought about a boy eating a biscuit on a platform wall. You can't be lost if you know your own name. She breathed in slowly, out slowly. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was a teacher. She was capable. She was not going to come apart in a boarding house room in Red Hollow, Colorado, because one man's promise had turned out to be hollow, and another man, a different man, a stranger with honest eyes, had offered her a way forward. She was going to decide what she wanted to do, and then she was going to do it. She sat with it for the long time, and then she stood up. She changed out of her traveling dress. She washed her face. She fixed her hair. She straightened her coat, and she picked up her suitcase. She would need it. She was not leaving it in a room she hadn't fully decided on yet, and she went back downstairs. Mrs. Aldridge was still in the kitchen. "I need to go to the livery stable," Clara said. The older woman looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "First right out the front door, then left at the feed store. Can't miss it." "Thank you." "Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Aldridge said it quietly. "Room will be here when you need it, whatever you decide." Clara nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge." She walked out into the cold night air of Red Hollow. Elias Boone was exactly where he said he would be, standing outside the livery stable, working loose a knot in his horse's reins, with the same focused patience she imagined he brought to most things. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. He did not look surprised to see her. He did not look triumphant either. He just looked like a man who had waited and was now done waiting. "Mrs. Aldridge vouch for me?" he asked. She did. Clara stopped in front of him. So did the Reverend. She had stopped at the church on the way. The Reverend's wife had opened the door and confirmed everything without even being asked. Apparently, Elias Boone was the kind of person that people in Red Hollow spoke well of as a matter of reflex. "And the sheriff?" Elias asked. "I didn't think I needed to go that far." Again that almost smile. "Wise use of your time." She faced him squarely. "I'll take the bookkeeping work. But I want a clear agreement written down, not just a handshake. Pay duties hours and the understanding that it is a professional arrangement and nothing else." "That's exactly what I'd want," he said. "I'll have it written up tomorrow morning. I'll stay at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house for now." "That's sensible. And I want to be clear about something else, Mr. Boone." She held his gaze. "I am not coming to your ranch because I have no other option. I am coming because I have decided it is a reasonable choice. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "There is." She nodded once. He untied the horse and she stood beside him, and together, not quite side by side, but close enough, they walked out of the depot end of Red Hollow toward whatever came next. The wind off the mountains pushed cold at their backs. Above them, the sky over Colorado Territory was enormous and impossibly full of stars. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived that morning with everything lost, did not look back at the depot behind her. She had already decided she was done looking back. What she had not yet discovered, what she could not possibly have known, standing in that cold, starlit street with an honest stranger, and $11.40 and a worn family photograph, was that the town of Red Hollow was holding a secret. A secret that someone in this town was very, very determined to keep. And that secret had everything to do with why she was here, and why someone had needed her to give up and go home. The written agreement was ready by 7 o'clock the next morning. Clara had not expected that. She had half assumed Elias Boone would arrive at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house sometime mid-morning, hat in hand, with a vague verbal arrangement and a handshake offered. Like that was supposed to be enough. That was how men like Thomas Hargrove operated, with the confidence that a woman would accept whatever shape the offer came in because she didn't have the standing to demand a different one. But when she came downstairs at 6:45, still buttoning her cuff, there was already a folded document on the kitchen table with her name written on the outside in clean, deliberate handwriting. Mrs. Aldridge was standing at the stove with her back turned very pointedly, not saying anything. Clara picked it up and read it. Every term she had named the night before was in it. Pay fair as she remembered. Duties: bookkeeping, records management, correspondence when needed. Hours: 6 days a week. Sundays off. And at the bottom, in plain language that left no room for misreading: "This agreement constitutes a professional arrangement between Elias J. Boone and Miss Clara M. Whitmore. No other obligations, implicit or explicit, are created by its terms." He had written that part himself. She was certain of it. Not a lawyer's language. A man's language chosen carefully. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket beside the worn family photograph, and sat down to breakfast. "He dropped it off before sunup," Mrs. Aldridge said, still not turning around. "Didn't knock, just slid it under the door." "Of course he did," Clara said quietly. She ate her eggs. She drank her coffee. She signed the agreement and left it on the table for Mrs. Aldridge to pass back, and then she put on her coat and walked out to meet whatever Red Hollow intended to do with her next. She did not let herself feel relieved. Relief was a luxury. She was still $11.40 from nothing. Still a stranger in a town that hadn't asked for her. Still the woman who had arrived crying at a depot with a worthless letter and nowhere to go. One fair agreement didn't change that. But it was a floor. And right now, a floor was everything. The wagon was waiting at the end of 2nd Street. Elias Boone sat on the bench with the reins loose in his hands, looking at nothing in particular, in the way of a man who is comfortable with stillness. He glanced at her when she appeared, and that was all. No commentary on the hour, no observation about the cold, no unnecessary words of any kind. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She climbed up onto the bench without waiting for help. He made no move to offer it, and no comment about her not needing it, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved. The ranch was 4 miles north, as he had said, and for the first 2 miles, neither of them spoke. Clara had half prepared herself for the kind of man who fills silence with sound, who talks about the weather or the road, or his own opinions on things nobody asked about, simply because silence makes him uncomfortable. Thomas Hargrove had been like that. Thomas had an opinion about everything, and delivered each one as though he were doing you a kindness. Elias Boone apparently had nothing to prove to the morning air. Finally she said, "How long have you had the ranch?" 8 years, he said. Bought it from a man named Cutter, who decided ranching was harder than he thought it would be. Paid him what it was worth, and not a penny more. And before that, worked other men's cattle. He paused. Worked other men's everything for a while. Decided eventually I'd rather work my own. She considered that. The records, how far behind are they? 3 months. Organized or scattered? Depends on your definition. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. Scattered, she said. Yes. She almost smiled. She didn't, but the impulse was there, and that surprised her. All right, I'll need a full morning just to assess what's there before I can tell you how long it'll take to put right. Take whatever time you need. I won't take more than I need. I know, he said simply. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing he'd said to her yet, that simple, quiet confidence that she would be competent. She wasn't used to it. She was used to men who either doubted her loudly or trusted her with the small things while reserving judgment on the large ones. She was not used to a man who said "I know" before she had proved anything at all. She filed that away and said nothing else until the ranch came into view. The first thing she noticed was the kitchen table. Not because of what was on it, though. What was on it was considerable. A 3-month avalanche of receipts and purchase orders and payroll records and cattle tallies, all stacked in piles that bore the unmistakable look of a man who knew where everything was by a system that existed only in his own head. What she noticed was the look on his face when she sat down in front of it. Not embarrassment exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been managing alone for a long time and has just realized, looking at it through someone else's eyes, exactly how much managing they've been doing. It's worse than scattered, she said. Yes. But it's all here. Everything. I don't throw things away. That's in your favor. She was already sorting her hands, moving through the stacks with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years organizing other people's chaos. Who was keeping these before the last person left? I was. She stopped and looked up at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her work with the same quiet attention he seemed to bring to everything. You were running a cattle ranch and keeping your own books at the same time, she said, for about a year before Mitchell came on, and for the 3 months since he left. How many head of cattle? 240. And you have ranch hands? 4. She looked back at the table. Mr. Boone, you are an extremely busy man who has been doing 3 jobs. Most ranchers are, he said. Most ranchers don't survive it with all the receipts. That slight shift at the corner of his mouth again. No, I suppose they don't. She turned back to the records and got to work. By noon she had established 3 things. First, the books were not as hopeless as they appeared. Elias's system was eccentric and entirely self-invented, But it had an internal logic to it once she understood his categories. He had simply never been taught to record things in any standardized way, so he had invented his own way, and it was actually not terrible. Second, there was an irregularity in the payroll records from July that she couldn't explain yet. A payment that went out, a significant one larger than any single wage entry, with a notation beside it that said simply, HD land settlement in handwriting that wasn't Elias's. Third, Mitchell, the previous bookkeeper, had left something behind that Elias might not have known about. Tucked inside the back cover of last year's ledger, pushed there, she thought, rather than simply left, was a folded piece of paper covered in names and numbers. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not say anything about it yet. She set it aside in her mind the way she would set aside an unfamiliar word in a text noted held returned to later. She needed more information before she knew what she was looking at. At noon, one of the ranch hands knocked on the kitchen door and said something to Elias in a low voice that Clara didn't catch. She watched Elias's face change just slightly, just for a second, but she had spent the morning learning how to read small movements in a man who didn't offer large ones, and what she saw looked like controlled worry. "Problem," she said. He looked at her, seemed to make a brief decision. "One of the fence lines on the north pasture is down. Cattle are drifting toward Caldwell's land." "Caldwell," she said. The name felt familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. "Harvey Caldwell. He owns the land north and east of mine." The controlled worry sharpened very slightly into something else. "He's made it clear he considers any of my cattle on his land a trespass." That seems like a legal issue rather than a moral one. "It's both with Caldwell." He was already moving toward the door, pulling his coat off the hook. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon. There's bread and cheese in the larder. Help yourself." "Mr. Boone?" She said it before she'd entirely decided to. He stopped. "The payment notation in your July payroll records, the one marked HD land. What does that refer to?" He went very still, just for a moment, just long enough for her to notice. "I'll explain that when I get back," he said. He walked out. She turned back to the records. HD. Harvey. Caldwell's first name could be Harvey, or it could be something else entirely. She didn't know enough yet to assume, but she wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, because in her experience, the things that made honest men go still were always worth writing down. He came back at 3, and she could tell by the set of his shoulders before he said a word that the cattle problem had not resolved neatly. "Sit down," she said. "I made coffee." He looked at her for a beat. She had been here 6 hours. This was not her kitchen. She had no authority to make coffee or tell him to sit. And then he sat down, and she poured, and he put his hands around the cup, and she saw for just a moment how tired he was. Not today, tired. Years tired. The kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones of a person who has been carrying everything alone for so long that they can barely remember what it felt like to set something down. She did not comment on it. That would have embarrassed him. "Tell me about the HD land notation," she said instead. He looked at the coffee cup, then at her. "What makes you think that has anything to do with the fence?" "Nothing yet. I'm asking them separately. I'll sort out later whether they're connected." He was quiet for a long moment. "4 months ago," he said, "Harvey Caldwell came to me with what he called an offer. He wanted to buy a strip of my land, the north section along the fence line. Said he needed it for access to his eastern grazing range." "And you said?" "I said I'd think about it. And then I thought about it." His jaw tightened slightly. "And I said no. The north section isn't just grazing land. It's where my water rights run. If I sold that strip to Caldwell, he'd control the water access for the whole valley on his side of the line." Clara set her coffee cup down very carefully. "And the settlement payment. Caldwell claimed I owed him damages. Said one of my bulls had broken through the fence line 3 months prior and destroyed a section of his winter crop. Filed a claim with the county office." His voice stayed level, but something underneath it was anything but. "I didn't believe the bull had done it. The damage was inconsistent. But I couldn't prove otherwise, and the county clerk sided with Caldwell." He paused. "So I paid." "How much?" He told her. It was a significant sum, Enough to put a dent in any small ranch's operating capital. Enough to matter. And now the fence is down again, she said. Third time in 2 months. She looked at him. Mr. Boone, are you telling me the fence keeps coming down on its own? He met her eyes. I'm telling you, I can't prove it isn't. There it was. The thing that had been underneath his controlled worry all morning. Not just a fence problem. Not just a difficult neighbor. Something deliberate. Something patient. She thought about the folded paper she had found tucked inside the back cover of last year's ledger. The one in handwriting that wasn't Elias's. The one covered in names and numbers she hadn't yet fully made sense of. Your previous bookkeeper, she said carefully. Mitchell. Why did he leave? Another stillness. Shorter this time, but she caught it. He said he had family in Denver that needed him. Did you believe him? Elias set his coffee cup down. Looked at her directly. Miss Whitmore, why are you asking me that? She reached into her coat pocket and put the folded paper on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not touch it. Where did you find that? His voice was even. Entirely even. That was what told her it mattered. Inside the back cover of last year's ledger. It was pushed there, I think. Not lost placed. Someone put it there deliberately. He reached out and unfolded it slowly. She watched his face while he read. The color did not drain from it. He had too much control for that. But something in his eyes changed. Something got harder and quieter at the same time, the way iron gets when it's been in cold water. This is Mitchell's handwriting, he said. I thought it might be. These numbers. He turned the paper slightly so she could see it, though she had already memorized what was on it. This is Caldwell's cattle count. His actual cattle count going back 18 months. Compared to what he's been reporting to the county. Clara was very still. How different are they? She said, though she already knew. She had looked at enough numbers in the last 6 hours to recognize a significant discrepancy when it was sitting in front of her. Different enough, Elias said quietly, that Harvey Caldwell has been avoiding substantial tax and grazing fee assessments for the better part of 2 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the wind moved. The ranch settled. Mitchell knew this, she said. It looks that way. And then Mitchell left suddenly for Denver to be with family he'd never mentioned. Elias looked at her. Yes, he said. She felt the shape of it before she could articulate it. The way a pattern in a ledger becomes clear, not when you find the irregular entry, but when you find enough regular entries around it to understand what the irregular one was hiding. He found out about Caldwell's numbers, she said. And someone made it worth his while to go to Denver and take what he knew with him. Except he didn't take this. She nodded at the paper. He left it where he thought someone competent might eventually find it. Or, Elias said slowly, where he thought I might find it myself. Did you ever go through the old ledgers? I don't have time to go through the old ledgers. That's why I needed a bookkeeper. She thought about that. The deliberateness of it. The fence lines coming down the damage claims, the settlement payment that had drained Elias's operating capital, the bookkeeper who had disappeared just as things were becoming clear, and now the north section of land that Caldwell needed for water access. Harvey Caldwell was not just a difficult neighbor. Harvey Caldwell was working a plan. A slow, careful, expensive plan. The kind that a certain type of man builds when he has money and patience and no particular moral objection to using both as weapons against someone with less of each. He wants your ranch, she said. It wasn't a question. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a door banged in the wind. Somewhere one of the horses moved in its stall. He's made offers before, Elias said finally. I've always said no. So he changed his approach. She looked at the paper on the table. He started making it impossible to say no. Financial pressure, legal claims, the settlement, and when you still held on. She stopped. When I still held on, Elias finished quietly. He needed a different kind of pressure. She thought about that. And then she thought about something else. She thought about Gerald Putnam's letter. About a teaching position offered in February for a school that had closed in April. about an outdated letter that had brought a schoolteacher from Missouri to a Colorado depot with nothing but $11 and a worn family photograph. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice came out carefully. "Who owns the old schoolhouse property?" He looked at her. The look on his face was not surprise. It was something more complicated than surprise. It was the expression of a man who has just seen two things connect that he had been holding separately in his mind, and in the connecting they become something far worse than either was alone. "The school committee held it in trust for the town," he said slowly. "When the committee dissolved, who took ownership? It would have gone up for assessment. If no one claimed it by—" He stopped. "By the 1st of October, 3 weeks away. And if it goes unclaimed," she pressed, "whoever files a land claim with the county office can purchase it at assessed value, which is minimal. The building's been closed for months. No improvements." She looked at him steadily. "And that property borders which side of town?" He understood. She could see him understand the way you can see a person absorb the weight of something, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in the quiet settling of a face that has just been handed more gravity than it expected. "The north end," he said. "The end that would give Caldwell a complete land corridor from his east range all the way through to the main road. If Caldwell got the schoolhouse property, he got the corridor. If he got the corridor, he controlled the route to market that every small ranch in the valley used, including Elias's. He could charge, he could block, he could squeeze. And if he had gotten rid of the one person who might have organized the town around the school, the teacher, the one person who had a legitimate reason to fight for that building before she even arrived." Clara sat back in her chair. Her hands were flat on the table. She looked at them. She made herself breathe normally. "The letter," she said. "Gerald Putnam's letter. The school committee letter. He wrote to me in February, before the school closed." She said it slowly, hearing it differently, now that she was hearing it in this context. "Schools don't close in 6 weeks. There would have been discussion, debate, a committee meeting or several. People in this town would have known for months that the school was in trouble before it actually closed in April." "Yes," Elias said. He was very still. Someone who had influence with the county office. Someone who knew that a teacher arriving in September would have standing to petition for the school's reopening and block any land claim on the property. She looked up at him. "If the letter had simply never been answered, I would never have come. But if it was answered, and I arrived to find nothing, you'd have no money and no standing and no reason to stay," Elias said quietly. "You'd have gotten back on the first train east, which is exactly what almost happened." Silence. She let it sit for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said, "I need to see everything. Every record you have, every piece of correspondence, every receipt going back 2 years. I need to understand the full picture of what Caldwell has been doing, because right now I can see the shape of it, but I can't prove any of it, and proof is the only thing that matters." "Miss Whitmore." He stopped, started again. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it. She didn't address it. "I'm the only person sitting in your kitchen right now who has any reason to be angry on behalf of that schoolhouse," she said. "Because that letter brought me here. Whatever its original intent, it brought me here. And I am a schoolteacher, Mr. Boone. That building is what I came to Red Hollow for." She held his gaze. "I am not leaving until it's open again." He looked at her for a long, careful moment, and then he said with a quiet certainty that felt less like admiration and more like recognition, "No, I don't suppose you are." He stood up and went to the back room and came back with another ledger and set it on the table, and then another, and then a stack of correspondence tied with twine. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Red Hollow with nothing but her name and $11.40, pushed her coffee cup aside and got to work. She did not know yet what she would find. She did not know yet how deep Caldwell's reach went. How many people in Red Hollow had been bought, or frightened, or simply worn down into silence. She did not know that the county clerk who had ruled against Elias's bull would be the same man she would face 3 weeks from now in a different kind of confrontation. She did not know that Mitchell, the missing bookkeeper, was not as far away as Denver. She did not know that Harvey Caldwell had already been told about her, that a message had already been sent, that a man was already watching the road north of town, with instructions to report who came and went from the Boone Ranch. She did not know any of that. But she sat down at that kitchen table, and she opened the first ledger, and she started reading with the same focused, relentless attention she had once given to the first page of every new school year, because she had learned as a teacher that the only way to understand where something went wrong was to start at the beginning and read every single word until you found it. Outside, the light was going gold and long across the Colorado Valley. Inside, the only sound was the scratch of her pen and the turning of pages. And Elias Boone sat across the table from her, pulling the ranch correspondence toward him, and began to read alongside her because sometime in the last hour, without either of them saying so, this had stopped being one person's problem. It had become two. She found the first proof on the third day. It was buried inside a stack of county correspondence from 8 months ago. A letter on official stationery from the Red Hollow County Land Office, addressed to the school committee, informing them that a formal assessment of the schoolhouse property had been initiated due to what the letter called irregular enrollment reporting and potential misuse of public trust funds. Clara read it 3 times. Then she set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you don't want to drop. Elias. He was across the kitchen going through a separate stack of cattle records. He looked up at her tone immediately. "Come read this." He came and stood behind her and read it over her shoulder. She felt him go still. "The committee never mentioned this," he said. "No, because by the time this letter arrived, Putnam was probably already planning to leave. And whoever else was on the committee." She turned to look up at him. "Who else was on the school committee?" "Putnam was chairman. Bill Haverford ran the dry goods store, he'd have been treasurer. And Mabel Stokes, the Reverend's wife." He paused. "And Harvey Caldwell." Clara turned back to the letter. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Caldwell had been on the school committee. He had sat in those meetings. He had watched the enrollment numbers fall. He had known before anyone else in Red Hollow had known exactly when the school would become vulnerable. And he had known that Gerald Putnam, a decent but disorganized man who was already thinking about going back east, would never think to cancel the outstanding job offers he'd sent out in optimistic February before the March spiral that ended in April's closure. He had left that letter going east like a fishhook into open water. And Clara Whitmore had bitten. "He counted on me leaving," she said. "Yes. He needed the school empty and unclaimed for 3 more weeks." She kept her voice level, steady. She was angry, but anger without direction was just noise, and she had never had patience for noise. "If I had arrived and found work and settled in, I would have had standing to petition the county to hold the property in educational trust pending reopening. He couldn't file a land claim against an operating institution. He needed you gone before you understood what you were fighting for," Elias said quietly. "Well." She folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. That was his mistake. She put it with the growing pile of documents she was building in the right corner of the table. Ordered, dated, cross-referenced. The kind of evidence that a county assessor, or if it came to it a territorial judge, could follow without confusion. Elias watched her organize it and said, "You've done this before, not bookkeeping. This, pulling a case together." She glanced at him. "In Missouri, the school board tried to reduce our salaries without going through proper procedure 3 years ago. I organized the other teachers. We filed a formal objection with the county education board, cited the specific statutes they'd violated, and won." She set the last document squarely on the pile. "They were furious. I think they expected us to simply accept it." "Why didn't you?" "Because accepting things that are wrong doesn't make them right," she said. "It just makes you complicit in them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That situation in Missouri, was that before or after?" He stopped himself. "Before or after Thomas Hargrove," she said. He met her eyes directly. "I wasn't going to say his name." "You didn't have to." She almost smiled. Didn't quite. "After. By about a year. Thomas thought I should have accepted the salary reduction gracefully. He said drawing attention to yourself in professional disagreements was unbecoming. She paused. He had a great many opinions about what was becoming. And what did you think? I thought, she said, that a man who tells a woman her best qualities are unbecoming is not a man worth keeping. Elias said nothing. But something in his expression shifted a slight easing, like a tension released. She turned back to the records. They had work to do. On the fourth day, something happened that changed everything. Clara had begun walking into Red Hollow in the mornings before Elias brought her out to the ranch, partly to keep Mrs. Aldridge informed of her continued occupancy, partly because she had started asking quiet questions of the people she encountered, and partly because she had learned that small towns in the early morning before the day's business has fully started are the only time anyone tells you the truth without calculating it first. She was at the post office when she heard the name. Two men standing behind her waiting for the clerk, talking in the low voices of people who assume no one nearby is listening. Caldwell's brought in somebody from Denver, one of them said. What kind of somebody? Lawyer type, fancy coat. Arrived on yesterday's eastbound. What for? Filing, I expect. The October deadline's coming. He wants that schoolhouse locked up legally before anybody can make a fuss about it. Clara kept her face forward. Her hand, which had been reaching for the counter to slide her letter across, remained very still. Thought there was some teacher woman came in on the train, the second man said. Couldn't she cause trouble? What's she going to do? She's got no money, no connections, no position. Caldwell's probably not even worried about her. Maybe he should be, the first man said, and there was something in his voice, something dry and complicated, that made Clara think he was not entirely sorry about the position Caldwell was about to find himself in. She slid her letter across the counter, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the morning. She walked fast. Not because she was panicking. She was not panicking. She was reorganizing. A lawyer from Denver meant Caldwell was moving up his timeline. Whatever he planned to file, he wanted it filed before October 1st. That gave her less than 2 weeks, not 3. She turned north toward the ranch, then stopped herself. Elias would be at the north fence again this morning. The line had come down twice more in the last 3 days, with a consistency that had stopped feeling coincidental and started feeling like clockwork. She couldn't wait until he came back to town. She went to the livery stable and asked to hire a horse. The man there, old, weathered, with the assessing eyes of someone who had watched a lot of people make decisions under pressure, looked at her for a moment and said, "You're the teacher woman." "I am." "You ride?" "Yes." He looked at her for another beat. Then he said, "Take the bay. She's steady. Don't need to pay me till next week." She blinked. "You don't know if I'll come back." "You'll come back," he said, handing her the reins. "Anybody who looked like you did coming off that train and still looks like you do, now that person comes back." She did not know what to say to that. So she said, "Thank you," and she rode north. She found Elias at the fence line with 2 of his ranch hands, all 3 of them on their knees, examining something on the ground. He looked up when he heard the horse, and his expression went through 3 things very quickly. Surprise, concern, and then a sharp alertness when he read her face. "What happened?" She dismounted and told him. He listened without interrupting. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Cord, who couldn't have been more than 20, started to say something, and then looked at Elias and closed his mouth. When she finished, Elias said, "A Denver lawyer." "Yes." "Arriving yesterday." "Yes." He stood up from the fence, looked at the ground where he had been kneeling. Then he looked at Cord and the other hand and said, "See that cut there?" Both men looked. Clara looked. There was a clean cut in the fence wire, not a break-a-cut, the kind made by a tool. "Third time in 2 months with a clean cut," Cord said carefully. "Not once has it frayed or rusted through. It always cuts." "Who has access to this line?" Clara asked. "Anyone riding along the north boundary," Elias said. "Which on Caldwell's side is anyone he sends." "Do you have anything documenting the previous damage dates photographs?" She stopped herself. "Sketches, I mean. Written descriptions." "I wrote them down," Cord said, and she looked at him sharply. "In a little book I keep, dates, and what I saw, and who was with me. He said it almost defensively, like he expected someone to tell him it wasn't important. My father always said, write down what you see. Said it's the only thing that protects a working man when a richer man decides you didn't see it. Clara stared at him. Your father was right. Get me that book today. Cord nodded. She turned to Elias. We have less time than we thought. I need everything from the ranch that touches the schoolhouse property or Caldwell's land transactions. Every receipt, every letter, every county notice. And I need to speak with Bill Haverford and Mabel Stokes. Haverford won't want to get involved, Elias said. He's afraid of Caldwell, has been for years. That's his right. But he was on the school committee and he has information I need. He doesn't have to testify to anything. I just need to know what he knows. She put her foot in the stirrup and remounted the bay. What about Mrs. Stokes? Elias almost smiled. Mabel Stokes is afraid of exactly nothing and has been waiting for someone to give her a reason to say so publicly for approximately a decade. Good. Clara turned the horse toward town. I'll start with her. Mabel Stokes opened her door before Clara had finished knocking, as though she had been watching the road and waiting. I heard you were asking around town, the Reverend's wife said immediately, stepping back to let her in. I've been hoping you'd come to me. Clara stepped inside. You know why I'm here. I know what Caldwell's been doing. Mrs. Stokes said it flatly with the tone of a woman who has been carrying an injustice for so long that naming it was almost a relief. I've known for 6 months. I've known, and I haven't been able to do a thing about it because I couldn't prove it, and everyone I talked to was either afraid or paid off. The irregular enrollment report, Clara said. The one the county land office sent. Mrs. Stokes stopped, looked at her very directly. How do you know about that? I found a copy in Elias Boone's correspondence. It was sent to the committee. Caldwell brought it to the last meeting. Mrs. Stokes sat down heavily. He told us the county was considering seizing the property for unpaid assessments. He said the only way to avoid the school being taken by the county at a loss to the community was for the committee to dissolve voluntarily and allow a private sale. He said he had a buyer who would pay fair market value and preserve the building. Clara sat down across from her. And the buyer was... Mrs. Stokes looked at her hands. He never said a name, I asked. Putnam asked. He said it was being handled through a land agent and the details would be confirmed after dissolution. She looked up. I voted no. I was the only one who voted no. Putnam abstained. Haverford voted yes. And Caldwell, of course. 2-1. 2-1. The committee dissolved the next week. Putnam left for the East Coast within the month. She paused. I've been waiting for that buyer's name ever since. It never appeared in any public record. Because, Clara said slowly, if Caldwell filed the land claim himself, it would look exactly like what it is. He needed time for the connection to disappear. He needed the committee dissolve the building empty, and enough months passing that no one would connect him directly to the closure. She thought of the October 1st deadline. He was going to file it in his wife's name, or through a company, something that creates one more step between him and the property. Mrs. Stokes was quiet. He counted on all of us being too scattered and too defeated to put it together, Clara said. He counted on there being nobody here who cared enough to stay. Mrs. Stokes looked at her with something that was equal parts guilt and hope. And then you arrived. He didn't plan on that. No. The older woman straightened in her chair. What do you need from me? Everything you remember about those committee meetings. Written down, dated, signed with your name. I need your testimony, Mrs. Stokes. Not in a courtroom. Not yet. I need a sworn affidavit that I can take to the county assessor's office before the October deadline. Mrs. Stokes didn't hesitate. Get me paper, she said. I've been wanting to write this down for 6 months. By the end of that day, Clara had Mrs. Stokes's affidavit Cord's record book with its meticulous dated entries of fence damage, the county letter about the irregular enrollment report, and a growing understanding of exactly how Harvey Caldwell operated. How was not a man who did things violently or obviously. He was a man who used official channels the way other men used fists, as a weapon of first resort, wielded with the comfortable confidence of someone who has always been on the right side of the desk when official channels were applied. He had used the county office to pressure the school committee. He had used a fabricated damage claim to drain Elias's capital. He had used Mitchell bought or threatened. She still didn't know which to remove, the one person inside Elias's operation who might have noticed the pattern. And he had used Gerald Putnam's abandoned letter as a trap for the person most likely to fight for the school. The man was thorough. She would give him that. But he had made one significant error. He had assumed that the woman in the trap had no teeth. That evening, sitting across from Elias at the kitchen table, with everything they had gathered spread between them, Clara said, "I need to go to the county assessor's office tomorrow morning. They won't see you without an appointment." "I know. Caldwell has relationships there. The clerk who ruled on the bull claim." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm not going to ask for a favor. I'm going to file a formal petition to hold the schoolhouse property in Educational Community Trust, pending a public hearing on its status." He was quiet for a moment. "You can do that. If someone with standing files it, yes. The Territorial Education Code has a provision: if a community petition demonstrates sufficient interest in maintaining an educational institution, the county is required to hold a public hearing before permitting any land transfer. She had found the statute in a territorial legal digest that the Reverend kept in his study and had allowed her to borrow. The hearing has to be scheduled within 30 days of the petition. During that period, no private land claim can be processed. That buys you 30 days. "It buys us 30 days, she corrected. "And in those 30 days, we present everything to the assessor. The fraudulent damage claims, the fence tampering, Caldwell's cattle numbers compared to what he's been reporting, Mitchell's records, Mrs. Stokes's affidavit." He studied her face. "That's an accusation of fraud against one of the most influential men in this county." "Yes. He'll fight it." "I expect so. He has a lawyer from Denver." "I know." She held his gaze steadily. "Do you have a better idea?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the kitchen settled. Outside, a wind came up briefly and then quieted. "No," he said. "I don't." And then after another beat, "I'll go with you." She had expected to argue about this. She had prepared 3 separate responses to 3 separate versions of him trying to handle this himself, or trying to tell her it was too dangerous, or trying to find a reason she should let him take the lead. He didn't do any of those things. He just said he would go with her the same way he had said everything else, simply directly, with the understated certainty of a man who had decided and was done deliberating. She looked at the table, looked back at him. "This isn't your fight anymore. The school isn't your property." "No." He met her eyes. "But you are my concern. And what's right is my concern. Those haven't changed." She held that for a moment. Felt the weight of it. Not the weight of dependence, not the weight of someone else's decision overriding hers, but something different. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The weight of being genuinely seen by another person and not finding it a burden. She nodded once. 7 o'clock, she said. "I'll be here at 6:30, he said. She began organizing the documents for the morning. I was there at 6:15. She was already downstairs at Mrs. Aldridge's when she heard the wagon. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been pretending to concentrate on her biscuits, said without turning around, "That man has never been on time to anything in his life. He's been early to everything." Clara put on her coat. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "if something goes wrong today, if Caldwell finds out what we're filing before we can file it and moves to block us, is there anyone else in town I should speak with? Anyone who might have seen something they haven't said?" The older woman turned around fully. "You think he'll find out? He has someone watching the road from the ranch. Cord spotted a rider 3 nights running at the north boundary. If that rider reported to Caldwell that I came out yesterday, Caldwell knows something's changed." She buckled her coat. "He's had 12 hours to respond." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet. Then she said, "Talk to Pete Garland at the hardware store before you go to the assessor's office." Pete's boy worked for Caldwell for 2 years and left last spring without saying why. She paused. The boy came home with bruised knuckles and a story that kept changing. Pete never pushed because Pete needed Caldwell's supply contracts. But Pete's been angry about it ever since. A man carrying guilt that he let something go is a man who wants an opportunity to set it right. Clara was already at the door. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. Pete Garland took 4 minutes to decide. Clara laid out enough of what she knew, not everything, just enough in the back of his hardware store, while Elias stood near the door and said nothing. Pete listened with his arms crossed, and his jaw working, and his eyes going to the floor several times in the particular pattern of a man who is having a private argument with himself. Then he said, "My boy saw Caldwell's men cut the fence on Boone's north line 3 months ago. He was riding past on the county road and he saw it. He didn't say anything because Caldwell had already put it around town that anyone who caused trouble for him would find their credit lines reviewed." He looked at Elias. "I should have said something. I know I should have." "You're saying it now," Elias said. Pete looked at Clara. "What do you need?" "The same thing I need from everyone else," she said. "A written statement, signed, dated, specific." She paused. "And your boy's statement separately if he'll give it. Even if he won't, yours matters." "He'll give it," Pete said. "I'll bring him to you by noon." She thanked him and they left. In the wagon, Elias said, "That's 4 witnesses. 5 if we count Mitchell's document as evidence of someone who saw something." She was counting on her fingers. Mrs. Stokes, Cord, Pete, Pete's boy, and the county letter itself, which proves Caldwell had access to information about the school's vulnerability that he used to manipulate committee procedure. "Is that enough?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "It's enough to file. Whether it's enough to win the hearing is a different question." He nodded, looked at the road. "What happens if we file and Caldwell counters immediately? His lawyer could argue that your petition has no standing because you were never formally employed by the school." She had thought about this. It was the weakest point in her case and she knew it. The Territorial Education Code doesn't require the petitioner to be employed by the institution, she said. It requires the petitioner to demonstrate material connection to the educational purpose of the property. A teacher who came from Missouri, specifically in response to a school committee letter, has material connection. His lawyer will dispute that interpretation. His lawyer can dispute anything he likes. The petition only needs to be accepted to create the 30-day hold. After that, we have time to build the fuller case. She looked at him. The filing buys us time. The evidence wins us the hearing. He drove in silence for a moment. Then he said, "The West doesn't care if you're afraid. It only asks what you'll do when you are." She looked at him. "Is that something your father said?" "Something I figured out the hard way." A pause. "You seem afraid and completely unafraid at the same time. I'm not sure how you do that." "Practice," she said. "Also, there's no alternative." He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. They reached the county assessor's office at 8:30. The clerk at the front desk was a thin man named Edelman, who looked at Clara over his glasses with the expression of a man who has processed many things and found most of them not worth his attention. "I'd like to file a community educational trust petition for the Red Hollow schoolhouse property," she said. She set the petition on his desk. It was 3 pages handwritten, citing the specific territorial statute, signed by Clara Whitmore, countersigned by Mabel Stokes as a former committee member and accompanied by the sworn affidavit. Edelman picked it up. He read the first page. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at her and said, "This is going to be contested. I expect it will be. The party most likely to contest it is a man with considerable standing in this county. I'm aware of that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias, who was standing 2 steps behind her and had said nothing since they walked in. Then he looked back at the petition. "I'll need to consult the territorial code to confirm the statutory basis," he said. "Section 42, paragraph 7, Clara said. Community educational preservation provisions enacted by the territorial legislature in 1878. The specific language is on page 2. Edelman looked at page 2. He was quiet for a long time. Clara did not fidget. She did not shift her weight. She stood exactly as she was, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the moment you show a bureaucrat you need something urgently is the moment they begin to wonder if they have the power to withhold it. Finally, Edelman set the petition down and reached for his stamp. He stamped it. He wrote the date. He wrote the time. He handed her the receipt copy. "You'll be notified of the hearing date within 5 business days," he said, "during which time the property is subject to transfer hold per section 42. He paused. "Good day, Miss Whitmore." She picked up the receipt copy, folded it, put it in her coat pocket right beside the Warren family photograph, and the copy of the written agreement, and the county letter about the irregular enrollment. Her pocket was getting full. She thanked him and walked out. On the front step, in the cold October air, she stopped and let out a breath she had been holding since approximately the hardware store. Elias came out behind her and stood beside her on the step. "That's the 30 days, she said. "Yes." "Now we need to build the rest of it." "Yes." She started down the steps. He fell into step beside her. They were halfway down the street when a carriage came toward them from the opposite direction, expensive, well-maintained, drawn by 2 matched bays that announced money without having to say anything about it. The carriage slowed. The window came down. Harvey Caldwell looked at them from inside it. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades being agreed with and had come to find disagreement physically confusing. He looked at Elias first, then at Clara. His eyes stayed on her longer than was comfortable. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was pleasant, deliberately pleasant, the kind of pleasant that is a message in itself. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Harvey Caldwell. I own the land adjacent to Mr. Boone's ranch." "I know who you are, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I've heard you've been asking around town." He smiled. "In a town this size, conversations travel fast. I imagine you've heard a great many things about me." "A great many things," she agreed pleasantly. "I hope you'll take them with appropriate skepticism. Small towns have long memories and short perspectives." He was still smiling. "I also hope you won't let yourself be used as a tool in other people's local disputes, Miss Whitmore. You're new here. You may not fully understand the history involved." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a teacher, Mr. Caldwell. Understanding history is rather my specialty." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, he was too practiced for visible anger. Something colder, the recalculation of a man who has encountered resistance he didn't fully account for. "Good morning," she said. She walked on. Elias walked beside her. He said nothing until the carriage was well behind them, and then he said very quietly, "He's going to move faster now." "Yes," she said. "So are we." She did not look back at the carriage. She was done looking back. But she felt it behind her. The weight of Caldwell's attention suddenly redirected from a manageable inconvenience to something more serious. Something that would require a different kind of response. She was right. Because what she did not know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Mitchell, the missing bookkeeper who had gone to Denver, had not gone alone. And what he had taken with him was not just knowledge. He had taken a document. A second document, one she hadn't found in the ledger because it had never been in the ledger because Mitchell had never put it there. He had kept it. And Harvey Caldwell knew he had it. And that changed everything about what Caldwell was willing to do next. The letter arrived at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house the next morning. No envelope. No stamp. Someone had slipped it under the front door sometime in the night, and Mrs. Aldridge had found it on the floor when she came down at 5 to start the stove. She had left it on the kitchen table without opening it, and when Clara came downstairs at 6, she saw her name written on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it standing at the table still in her coat. It was short. 8 lines. No signature. "Miss Whitmore. You don't know me, but I know what you've been doing, and I know what Caldwell is planning to do about it. He sent his lawyer to the telegraph office yesterday afternoon. There is a man in Denver who has something Caldwell needs. Caldwell is offering him enough money to disappear permanently. Once that man is gone, everything you've built your case on becomes uncorroborated. You have less time than you think. If you want to find Mitchell before Caldwell does, he's not in Denver. He's in Pueblo. The Frontier Hotel, Room 11. He's been there for 3 weeks waiting to see which way this goes. A friend. Clara read it twice. Then she sat down. Mrs. Aldridge put a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked and sat down across from her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Clara looked at the letter. She thought about the shape of it, the specific information, the urgency, the careful anonymity. Someone in Red Hollow who knew Caldwell's movements well enough to know about a telegraph sent yesterday afternoon. Someone who wanted Caldwell stopped but wasn't willing to put their name on it yet. Someone who worked for Caldwell or near him, close enough to watch, afraid enough to stay hidden, angry enough to write. She thought about what the letter meant in practical terms. Mitchell was in Pueblo, not Denver, Pueblo, which was closer, which meant he had never gone as far as the story said. He had stopped short of Denver and been waiting. 3 weeks, the letter said. He arrived in Pueblo about a week after he left Red Hollow, which meant he had not left Red Hollow impulsively. He had planned this. He had left the folded document in the ledger not as evidence for Elias, but as a signal. A breadcrumb. The action of a man who has put himself in a dangerous position and is waiting to see if anyone is smart enough and brave enough to follow the trail. He had been waiting to see who would find it. She had found it. Now Caldwell knew she had found it, and he was moving to cut off the one remaining piece she didn't yet have. She stood up. "I need to send a wire," she said. "Post office opens at 7, Mrs. Aldridge said. "I know." Clara folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "I also need Elias here by 6:30. I'll send the boy." She was already on the stairs. Elias read the letter in 40 seconds and said, "I'll go to Pueblo." "We'll go to Pueblo," she said. He looked up from the letter. "Clara, don't." She said it quietly, but with a complete absence of negotiation. "Mitchell left that document for someone to find. I found it. Whatever he has, whatever the second document is, he's been deciding for 3 weeks whether to bring it forward or take Caldwell's money and disappear. If I go to him, he's talking to the person who found his breadcrumb. That means something." She paused. "If you go alone, he's talking to a rancher with a land dispute. That means something different." Elias was quiet. "You know I'm right," she said. He handed the letter back. "The morning train to Pueblo leaves at 8:10. It's a 4-hour ride." "I know. We'd be back by tonight if Mitchell talks quickly. And if he doesn't talk quickly, then we stay until he does." He was already pulling on his coat. "I'll wire ahead to the Frontier Hotel." "No," she said immediately. "Don't put his name on a wire. If Caldwell has anyone watching the telegraph lines—" Elias stopped, looked at her, nodded once. "You're right. We go without warning him." She picked up her bag. She had already packed the essential documents, the copies, not the originals, which she had left with Mrs. Stokes for safekeeping. She had thought about this at 4 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, which was when she did some of her clearest thinking. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said. The older woman appeared in the doorway. "If anyone comes asking where we've gone, you're visiting a former student of yours who lives west of town," Mrs. Aldridge said without hesitation. "I'll make sure I say it to at least 3 people so it gets around fast." Clara looked at her, felt a sudden surprising warmth that she didn't have time for right now. "Thank you," she said. "Go," Mrs. Aldridge said. "And be careful, both of you." The train to Pueblo was half empty in the early morning, and they sat across from each other with the document copies between them and talked through everything they knew quietly in the voices of people who understand they are in a public space and govern themselves accordingly. Somewhere around the second hour, when they had been through the documents twice and the conversation had naturally slowed, Elias said, "Tell me something." She looked up from the papers. "What? Why did you become a teacher?" She considered the question. Considered whether it was the right time for it. decided that 4 hours on a train was as good a time as any for honest conversations. My mother was sick for most of my childhood, she said. My father worked the farm. There wasn't much money, and there wasn't much time for anything that didn't keep us alive. She looked at her hands. But we had books. My mother had brought them from her own family, this whole shelf of them. History, philosophy, poetry stories. And she read them to us every night, even when she was tired enough to fall asleep mid-sentence. She paused. She used to say that a person who reads widely can never be entirely trapped, because they've seen enough of the world inside books to know that wherever they are isn't all there is. Elias was quiet, listening. I became a teacher because of that shelf, she said. Because I wanted to be the person who handed other people's children the key that my mother handed me. She looked up at him. Does that sound too simple? No, he said. It sounds exactly right. She studied him. And you, the ranch. Why? He looked at the window for a moment. My father was a tenant farmer his whole life. Worked another man's land, answered to another man's rules, built something good every year, and had no claim on any of it. His jaw tightened slightly. He was a good man. He deserved better than that. But the land was never his, so the work was never entirely his either. He paused. I decided when I was about 15 years old that I was going to own the ground I stood on, whatever it took. And it took a lot, she said quietly. Everything I had, more than once. He looked back at her. But it's mine. Every acre and every fence post and every rock and every field. Mine. He paused. Nobody gets to take that. Nobody gets to take that. She understood suddenly and completely why Caldwell's slow campaign against the ranch was the particular kind of injury it was. It was not just property. It was the thing Elias had built his entire adult life around. Not greed, not pride in the ordinary sense, but the bone-deep conviction that a man who works honestly deserves to keep what his honest work has built. Caldwell was not just trying to take land. He was trying to take the meaning of everything Elias had sacrificed to own it. She felt the anger come back clean and cold and useful. He's not going to win, she said. Elias looked at her. I know, he said. The Frontier Hotel in Pueblo was easy to find and not particularly grand, which told her something about Mitchell's situation. A man who had been paid well to disappear would not be staying somewhere modest. Mitchell had not taken Caldwell's money. Not yet. She went alone to room 11. Elias waited in the lobby, which had been his idea, and hers simultaneously. Mitchell would be suspicious of a man he didn't expect, and she needed the first 30 seconds of this conversation to go well. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. Mr. Mitchell, my name is Clara Whitmore. I'm a school teacher from Red Hollow. I found what you left in the ledger. I filed the petition 3 days ago. The 30-day hold is in effect. She paused. Caldwell sent a wire to Pueblo yesterday afternoon. If he knows you're here, he'll send someone by tomorrow morning at the latest. I need to talk to you right now. A long silence. Then a sound of movement. The scrape of a chair. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain. The man looking through the gap was younger than she expected. Mid-20s. Thin, with the kind of eyes that have been watching their own door for long enough that caution had become reflexive. You're really her, he said. The teacher they sent the letter to. Yes. You actually came after all of it. You came and you stayed. Yes. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he closed the door. She heard the chain slide. The door opened fully. Come in, he said. Quick. His name was Thomas Mitchell. She noted the name with a small private flinch that she did not show, and he had been Elias Boone's bookkeeper for 8 months before he left, and in those 8 months he had made one decision he was proud of, and one he was ashamed of, and they were directly related. He was proud of keeping the document. He was ashamed of not having given it to Elias before he left. I was afraid, he said. He sat across from her at the room's small table, his hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. Caldwell came to me directly. In October, 6 months before I left. He knew I'd been going through the older ledgers doing the annual reconciliation. He knew I'd seen his cattle numbers compared to the county reports. How did he know? The county clerk, Edelman. Mitchell looked at the table. Edelman is Caldwell's, has been for years. When I requested the county's official cattle census records for the reconciliation, which I had every right to do as a licensed bookkeeper, Edelman told Caldwell within a day. Clara filed this carefully. Edelman. The same clerk who had stamped her petition 3 days ago, who had looked at her with his careful, assessing eyes. The man who had told Caldwell she'd filed before she'd even reached the bottom of the front steps. She kept her face neutral. What did Caldwell offer you? $500 and a reference letter that would get me work anywhere in the territory. Mitchell looked up at her. The shame in his face was genuine. I have a mother in Colorado Springs who's ill. I needed that money. I told myself the document was just numbers, that it wasn't my fight, that Boone was a grown man who could manage his own. He stopped. I told myself a lot of things. But you kept the document. I couldn't make myself hand it over. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded envelope heavier than she expected. And I couldn't make myself destroy it. So I left the partial record in the ledger enough for someone careful to notice, and I kept this. He pushed the envelope across the table. And I've been sitting in this hotel room for 3 weeks telling myself that if someone smart enough and brave enough to follow the trail showed up, that meant the situation had a chance. And if no one showed up... He stopped. You would have taken the money, she said. He looked at the table. I don't know. Maybe. I'd like to think no, but I don't know. She picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a document she had not expected. It was a contract. A land contract dated 14 months ago between Harvey Caldwell and a company called Western Horizon Land Associates for the purchase and development of a continuous land corridor, described in precise legal language with survey coordinates she recognized as matching the north section of Elias's ranch, the schoolhouse property, and several other parcels contingent upon successful resolution of current ownership encumbrances within an 18-month period. The 18-month period ended in 3 weeks. And at the bottom, in a signature block that made her breath go short. For just a moment was not just Caldwell's name. There were 2 other names. A Denver land developer she didn't recognize. And County Assessor William Pratt. The man who sat above Edelman. The man who would ultimately rule on her petition and conduct the public hearing. The county assessor, who was supposed to evaluate her case fairly, had already signed a contract to profit from the outcome Caldwell needed. She set the document down. She looked at Mitchell. Does anyone else know this exists? She said. Caldwell knows I have something. He doesn't know exactly what. When he came to me when he made the offer, he asked me to hand over anything I'd copied or retained. I told him I hadn't kept anything. He paused. He didn't believe me. That's why he's been watching. That's why he sent the wire. He's been building pressure for 3 months, hoping you'd take the money eventually. Yes. And now he knows I filed the petition and the timeline has changed. Yes. She looked at the contract, looked at William Pratt's signature. If this goes to the scheduled hearing, she said slowly, it goes to a hearing presided over by a man who has a financial interest in ruling against us. Yes. Which means the hearing itself is compromised before it begins. Mitchell nodded. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she had and what she needed, and how the pieces fit together differently. Now that she knew the hearing was not the solution she'd believed it was 3 days ago. She needed to go above the hearing. She needed to go above Pratt, which meant she needed the territorial governor's office, or the Federal Land Commission. Or, and this was the option that felt most possible in the time, they had a territorial judge willing to issue an emergency injunction against the land transfer on the grounds of assessor corruption. She did not know a territorial judge, but she knew someone who might. She stood up. I need you to come back to Red Hollow with me, Mr. Mitchell, today, on the afternoon train. I went pale. Caldwell's men. You've been sitting in this room for 3 weeks while Caldwell has been tightening the trap, she said. He's going to send someone here tomorrow, regardless of whether you've decided anything. Staying is not safe. Coming forward is dangerous, but it has an outcome. She held his gaze. You left a document in a ledger for someone to find because you hadn't entirely given up. Don't give up now. He looked at the table, his hands, the cold cup. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying a wrong decision for long enough that the right decision, when it finally shows up, feels like something between relief and terror. "All right," he said. "All right, let me get my things." She went back down to the lobby. Elias was standing exactly where she had left him, and the look on his face when he read her expression told her he already knew it was bigger than they thought. "How bad?" he said. She told him, quickly in low sentences, the shape of it. Mitchell, the contract, Pratt's name. Elias was very still when she finished. "Pratt," he said. "Yes." Pratt, who approved the bull damage claim. She had not made that connection yet. She made it now in real time, and felt it settle into the pattern with the cold precision of a key turning in a lock. Of course. Edelman processed the claim. Pratt approved it. Both of them inside Caldwell's arrangement. Both of them instruments of a plan that had been running for over a year before she ever set foot in Red Hollow. "Do you know anyone who could get us to a territorial judge?" she asked. I thought for exactly 4 seconds. "Judge Harlan Morse. He rode circuit through this valley 3 years ago. He stayed at the ranch for 2 nights during a storm and we talked." He paused. "I don't know if he'd remember me." "You'll have to hope he does. Where is he based?" "Colorado Springs, I think." "We can wire from Pueblo before the afternoon train." She was already moving toward the door. "We need to be careful how we word it. We can't put Pratt's name on a public telegraph. What do we say?" She thought for 3 steps. "We say, Judge Morse, urgent matter of assessor jurisdiction integrity in Red Hollow land petition. Evidence of prior financial conflict. Seeking emergency consultation. E. Boone." She looked at him. Short enough to be cryptic, specific enough that a judge knows exactly what it means. Elias looked at her with something she was starting to recognize, that particular quality of attention that meant he was not simply hearing her, but genuinely registering her. Not because she had surprised him exactly, but because she kept meeting moments he expected to be beyond her and walking straight through them without slowing down. "When did you learn to think like this?" he said. "When I stopped waiting for someone else to solve things," she said. "And then because the moment deserved honesty. And when I got angry enough that being afraid stopped being louder than being right." He held the door for her. Not because she needed it held, because it was the right thing to do. She walked through. Mitchell came down with a single bag and the hunched, rapid movement of a man who has made a decision and needs to act on it before he can talk himself out of it. They went to the telegraph office together, sent the wire to Judge Morse, and were on the afternoon train back to Red Hollow before 2 o'clock. On the train, Mitchell talked. He talked for 2 hours, and everything he said built the picture more completely. Caldwell's relationship with Edelman went back 7 years since Edelman first took the clerk position, which he had gotten with Caldwell's financial backing. Pratt's arrangement was newer, only 18 months old, which was exactly when Caldwell had begun assembling the land corridor deal with Western Horizon. The Denver developer, whose name was Ames, had been buying up rural Colorado parcels for 3 years, always through intermediaries, always in places where local officials had already been positioned. Red Hollow was not the first. It was not even the second. There were 4 other communities in the territory where a variation of the same pattern had played out: economic pressure on the most valuable landowner, manipulation of local institutions, a compromised county assessor to approve the transfers. In 2 of those communities, people had pushed back and found themselves suddenly facing tax assessments, legal claims, or mysterious accidents of paperwork that buried them in process while the deadline passed. Clara listened to all of it and wrote notes in her small notebook. "This is bigger than Red Hollow," she said. "Yes," Mitchell said. "This is a territorial matter." "Yes." "Which means the territorial attorney general might be interested in it." Mitchell and Elias both looked at her. "That's federal adjacent territory," Elias said carefully. "That's a much larger fight than—" "I know." She met his eyes. "But we already have the evidence. and evidence that shows 4 communities is more compelling than evidence that shows 1 ranch and 1 schoolhouse. She paused. Caldwell has been running this plan assuming that each community is isolated, that nobody in Red Hollow knows what happened in the other valleys, that nobody connects the dots. "Do you know what happened in the other valleys?" Elias asked. "Not yet." She looked at Mitchell. "But you do." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Some of it," he said. "Enough." She looked at him steadily. "Then we're going to write it all down tonight. Everything you know, dated specific and signed." He looked at the window. The Colorado landscape moving past, the mountains in the distance. "Caldwell is going to know I came back," he said. "Yes." "He's going to be very angry." "Yes." "He has more money than any of us, and more connections, and he's been doing this for years." "Yes." She did not soften any of it. "And you have the truth, and I have the evidence, and Elias has a ranch that he owns, and is not giving up. And Mrs. Stokes is the most formidable woman I have ever met in my life." She paused. "And as of this morning, we may have a territorial judge about to receive a very interesting telegraph." Mitchell looked at her. "You're not afraid of him at all," he said. It sounded like wonder. "Of course I'm afraid of him," she said. "I've been afraid since the moment I stepped off that train with $11 and a worthless letter." She looked at him evenly. "Being afraid and doing nothing are not the same thing, Mr. Mitchell. I decided a long time ago which one I could live with." They arrived back in Red Hollow at 6 in the evening. Mrs. Aldridge had kept dinner. She looked at Mitchell with the assessing eyes of a woman who has seen a great deal of human frailty and has decided not to hold most of it against people, set a plate in front of him and said, "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in 3 weeks." "I haven't," Mitchell said. "Well, eat first. Whatever comes next, you'll do it better fed." Clara could have kissed her. She sat at the table and let herself eat, and for 20 minutes she did not think about Caldwell, or Pratt, or the hearing, or the contract, or the territorial attorney general. She ate, and she listened to Mrs. Aldridge ask Mitchell gentle, careful questions about his mother in Colorado Springs, and she watched the man slowly unbend from the posture of 3 weeks of isolated fear, and she thought, this is also what fighting looks like. This table, this meal, this ordinary human act of being known by someone, after dinner. Elias pulled his chair close and said quietly, "There's something you should know." She looked at him. "While you were upstairs with Mitchell, I asked the train station agent if any messages had come in for me." He paused. "There was one. From Judge Harlan Morse." Her pulse jumped. He responded already. "He was in Pueblo today. Had come in this morning for a case. He got our wire, and he replied within the hour." Elias reached inside his coat and produced the message slip. She read it. "E. Boone received your wire. Matter you describe is one I have been made aware of in related context. Come to the county courthouse, Red Hollow, at 9 a.m. Thursday. Bring everything. H. Morse." She looked up. Thursday was 2 days away. "He said related context," she said. "Yes. He already knows something about this." "That's what it sounds like." She sat back in her chair and thought about that. Judge Morse riding circuit through the territory, presiding over case after case in county after county. How many times in the last year or two had he seen a pattern that looked familiar? How many times had he been in a courtroom where a county assessor's ruling had a quality to it that didn't quite fit the facts? Maybe they were not the first people to notice. Maybe they were just the first people to come with enough proof to do something about it. She looked at the message slip, then at Elias. 2 days, she said. 2 days. We need everything organized, every document, every affidavit, Mitchell's full statement, Cord's record book, Pete Garland and his son. She was already thinking through the sequence. And I want to talk to Haverford. He won't come forward. He might not have to. She thought about what Mitchell had told her on the train. He was on the committee. He voted yes. If he didn't know about Caldwell's arrangement with Pratt, and I don't think he did, then he's a witness, not a co-conspirator. A frightened witness, but a witness. She paused. I'm going to go to him tonight, and I'm going to give him the chance to choose which side of this he wants to be on when Judge Moore sits down in that courthouse." Elias looked at her for a moment. "You've thought of everything," he said. "I've thought of everything I can think of," she said. "There are things I haven't thought of. There are things Caldwell's lawyer from Denver is thinking of right now that I haven't anticipated." She met his eyes. "But I'm not going to let that stop me from moving." He nodded, and then quietly, "Clara." She looked at him. It still caught her slightly off guard, her given name in his voice, not because it was presumptuous, but because he said it with such careful attention that it always felt deliberate, like he had decided to say it and meant it. "You came here with a worthless letter and nowhere to go," he said, "and you built this from nothing, in 3 weeks." "We built it," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I helped. This was you." She held his gaze for a moment, felt the truth of it, and the weight of it, and the complicated, warm, slightly terrifying thing underneath both. "Don't be kind to me right now," she said quietly. "I still need to go talk to Haverford, and if you say something like that again, I might—" She stopped. "Might what?" he said, very quietly. She stood up. "I'll be back in an hour," she said. She put on her coat and walked out into the night. She was smiling. She did not let herself smile until she was out the door, and then she did briefly alone in the cold air of Red Hollow, before she straightened her coat and walked toward Haverford's dry goods store and the last conversation she needed to have before Thursday morning. She did not know yet that Caldwell had already made his next move. She did not know that when she got to Haverford's, the lights would be off and the door would be locked, and that Bill Haverford had packed a bag that afternoon and taken the evening train east. She did not know that taped to the inside of the dry goods store door, visible only when she pressed her face close to the glass, was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written on it in a shaking hand. She could just make them out in the darkness. "He threatened my family." And underneath it, in smaller writing barely legible, "I'm sorry. Look in the floorboard behind the counter, 3rd plank from the left." Clara stood at that window for 3 full seconds. Then she tried the door handle. It was unlocked. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The store was dark and cold and smelled of sawdust and dried beans, and the particular kind of quiet that settles into a place when the person who runs it has left in a hurry. Clara moved carefully, one hand out in front of her toward the counter. Her eyes adjusted. She found the edge of the counter with her fingertips and moved behind it. 3rd plank from the left. She knelt, pressed her fingers along the floor until she found the plank that gave slightly under pressure, not rotted, but deliberately loosened. The nails backed out just enough to allow lifting. She worked her fingers under the edge and pulled. The space underneath was shallow, just enough. Inside was a tin box, the kind used for keeping documents dry. She pulled it out, set it on the counter, and opened it. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. Inside the tin box were 3 things. The first was a letter handwritten from Harvey Caldwell to Bill Haverford, dated 4 months ago. In it, Caldwell outlined in plain language, with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable, that Haverford's vote to dissolve the school committee was expected, that his continued silence regarding the land assessment process was required, and that failure to maintain that silence would result in Caldwell calling in the promissory note he held against Haverford's store. The note was substantial, enough to close the business. The second was the promissory note itself, signed, dated, Haverford's name on the bottom line in the slightly cramped handwriting of a man who knew he was signing away his freedom. The third was a ledger page torn cleanly from a book she didn't recognize, showing a series of payments from an account marked WHLA, which she recognized immediately as Western Horizon Land Associates, to a recipient listed only as EP. The amounts were quarterly. The dates matched precisely with the period during which County Assessor William Pratt had made the rulings that benefited Caldwell's plan. EP. Easy enough. Elias had told her Pratt's full name on the train back from Pueblo. Ezra Pratt. She stood up from behind the counter holding the tin box and thought with a clarity that felt almost physical. Haverford couldn't face us. He couldn't put his name on anything. But he could leave the door unlocked and the box in the floor, and let whoever was brave enough walk in and find it. It was the most he could do. It was enough. She walked out of the store and back into the night, and she moved fast, because there was no more time for anything but fast. She was back at Mrs. Aldridge's in 12 minutes. Elias was still at the table. Mitchell was across from him, his written statement half finished. They both looked up when she came through the door, and what they saw on her face brought them both to their feet. She put the tin box on the table. "Haverford left," she said. "Caldwell threatened his family, but he left us this." She opened the box. She watched their faces as they read. Mitchell picked up the ledger page with the EP payments, and his breath went out in a long, slow release. "That's what I didn't have," he said. "I knew money was moving, but I couldn't find the account. The WHLA payments were processed through a Denver bank. I couldn't access those records from here." He looked at her. "This is the direct line. Caldwell to Western Horizon to Pratt. This is the bribery." "In writing," she said. "In writing." He set it down. With dates. Elias was reading the letter to Haverford. His jaw was set. She could see the particular quality of his anger, not hot, not volatile, but the cold and permanent kind, the kind that doesn't flame up and burn out, but simply becomes a fixed feature of a man's conviction. "He put it in writing," Elias said. "The threat to Haverford. He put it in an actual letter." "Men who have never been held accountable get careless," Clara said. "He's been doing this for years with no consequences. He stopped being careful about documentation because he'd never needed to be." She sat down. She spread everything on the table. The tin box contents, the petition receipt, the contract with Pratt's signature, Mitchell's statement, Cord's record book, Mrs. Stokes's affidavit, Pete Garland's written account, his son's statement, which Pete had delivered that afternoon while they were on the train to Pueblo. She looked at the full shape of it. "Thursday morning," she said. 9 o'clock, Judge Morse. She looked at both of them. "We have 2 days to organize this into something a territorial judge can follow in a single sitting." "How do we organize it?" Mitchell asked. "Chronologically," she said. "Starting from the earliest action we can document, which is the promissory note. Caldwell held over Haverford dated 18 months ago, and moving forward to the present. Each piece labeled, each connection explained in plain language." She looked at Elias. "I'll write the narrative summary. You and Mitchell cross-reference the documents against it tonight." "All night," Mitchell said. "As much of it as we need." He looked at the pile, looked at her. Then he pushed his half-finished statement aside, picked up a fresh sheet of paper and said, "Tell me where to start." They worked until 2 in the morning. Mrs. Aldridge fell asleep in her chair by the kitchen fire at midnight, and none of them woke her. Elias made coffee twice. Mitchell's handwriting grew progressively smaller as the night went on, the sign of a man concentrating so hard that everything was compressing. Clara wrote the narrative summary in 3 drafts, the first 2 technical, the second 2 emotional, the third, finally, exactly right. Clear, sequential, devastating in its simplicity. By the time they finished, the picture was complete. Harvey Caldwell had spent 18 months constructing a fraudulent land acquisition scheme across multiple Colorado communities, using bribed county officials, manufactured legal claims, economic coercion, and the deliberate suppression of civic institutions, including the Red Hollow Schoolhouse, to assemble a land corridor for a Denver development company. He had threatened at least one community member's livelihood to ensure silence. He had driven another from the territory entirely. He had paid a county assessor directly to corrupt the official process meant to protect community interests, and all of it was documented. Every single piece of it. Clara set the completed package in the center of the table and looked at it. "That's the case," she said. "That's the case," Mitchell agreed. Elias looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you. I'll stay up and make sure everything's in order." "You need sleep too." "I need this to be right more than I need sleep." He said it simply. "Go." She looked at him. She was tired enough that her defenses were down, and she let herself feel for a moment the full reality of the last 3 weeks. The depot platform, the cold, The worthless letter. The $11. The written agreement slid under a door before sunup. The records on the kitchen table. The folded paper in the ledger. Pueblo. Mitchell. Judge Morse's wire. Haverford's tin box. And this man sitting at a table at 2 in the morning quietly making sure it was all in order. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for everything all at once, too many things to name separately. He met her eyes. "Get some sleep, Clara." She went upstairs. She did not fall asleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept without dreaming. Wednesday passed in controlled urgency. Elias went to speak with Sheriff Bill Pryor in the morning. Not Pratt, not Edelman, but Pryor, the actual law enforcement in Red Hollow. The man Elias had known since boyhood. He laid out what they had enough of it to get Pryor's attention without releasing the full package before the courthouse meeting. Pryor listened. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he said, "I always knew something was wrong with that bull damage ruling. A bull doesn't cut wire." "No," Elias said. "It doesn't." "I'll be at the courthouse Thursday morning," Pryor said, "with my deputy, officially as a courtesy to a visiting circuit judge." He paused. "Unofficially because I've been waiting 2 years for someone to give me a reason to look at Caldwell directly." Clara, meanwhile, went to speak with the parents of the children she had been quietly teaching at the ranch over the past weeks, the families from the surrounding valley, who had been bringing their children to her 3 mornings a week, unofficially in the absence of a functioning school. She had not thought of it as building a constituency. She had just been a teacher doing what teachers do when children are in front of them. But those parents, it turned out, had been paying attention. They had watched this woman arrive in their valley with nothing, attach herself to the most honest man they knew, and start fighting for something the whole community had quietly mourned and privately accepted as lost. One by one, she asked them if there is a public hearing before Judge Morse about the schoolhouse, will you come? One by one, they said yes. By Wednesday evening, 11 families had committed to be at the courthouse Thursday morning. She did not know until she told Elias that evening that 11 families represented roughly 2/3 of the remaining active households in the Red Hollow Valley. He looked at her when she said the number. "They've been waiting," he said. "They just needed someone to show them it was possible to act." "I know," she said quietly. "Fear is contagious, but so is courage." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had stopped trying to interpret, and started simply allowing that quiet, steady, deeply serious attention that she had come to understand was not complicated in its nature. It was just honest. In a world full of people who looked at her and saw what they wanted or expected. Elias Boone had the unusual quality of looking at her and seeing what was actually there. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "When I saw you at that depot," he said, "I saw someone fighting to stay on their feet. I didn't know anything about you, except that you hadn't given up when you had every reason to." He paused. "I still don't think you understand how rare that is." "Elias, I'm not done," he said gently but firmly. "I've been quiet about things, I should say, because timing matters, and because you had enough to carry without adding anything from me." He held her gaze. "But after tomorrow, whatever the outcome is, I don't want to keep being quiet about it." She looked at him. At this man who had offered her a chance to stand again on the worst night of her life, who had sat across a kitchen table from her for weeks, reading ledgers and drinking cold coffee, and never once made her feel like anything other than exactly who she was. "After tomorrow," she said carefully. "Let's see what we're standing on after tomorrow." He nodded. "Fair enough." She did not sleep at all that night. Thursday morning came in cold and clear. She was dressed and downstairs before 5. Elias arrived at 5:30. Mitchell was already at the table, his written statement in a neat folder in front of him, looking like a man who has decided something and is at peace with it, in the specific way of someone who knows the decision may cost them and has made it anyway. At 7, they walked to the courthouse together. They were not the first ones there. Mrs. Stokes was already on the front step. Behind her, Pete Garland and his son. Behind them, Cord, Elias's youngest ranch hand, in a clean shirt that had clearly been pressed with great care. And behind them, spreading back along the street, the families she had spoken to on Wednesday. Ranchers and their wives, women with children on their hips. Older men who had lived in this valley for decades and had watched it slowly constrict under Caldwell's growing influence. She stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps and looked at them. Her throat tightened. She breathed through it. Mrs. Stokes came down 2 steps and took her hand. "We came," she said simply. "You came," Clara said. "This is our town too, honey. It was just waiting for someone to remind us of that." Judge Harlan Morse was a compact, gray-haired man with sharp eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior and stopped being surprised by most of it. He arrived at 8:50 with a court reporter and a single aide, took one look at the assembled crowd outside the courthouse, and made no comment whatsoever. He set up in the main courtroom with a deliberateness that told Clara he had done this before, walked into a situation that was bigger than the official notice, said it would be assessed the room, and gotten on with it. Caldwell arrived at 8:55 with his Denver lawyer, a man named Ferris, broad-shouldered, expensive coat. The practiced confidence of a man who is used to walking into rooms and owning them. Caldwell did not look at Clara when he walked in. He looked at the crowd behind her. She saw the first crack in his composure. Just a small one, a slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration happening behind his careful public face. He had expected she realized that she would be alone, or nearly alone. He had expected that by now the fear he had spent months cultivating in this community would hold. He had not expected 11 families. He had not expected Mitchell sitting in the second row with his folder in his hands. He had not expected Sheriff Pryor standing quietly at the back of the room in his official capacity. She watched him put it together, and she held herself very still and let him look. Then she turned to face Judge Morse. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Morse ran it with the controlled efficiency of a man who had already read everything that mattered before he walked in the room. She realized about 20 minutes in that he had been doing exactly that since receiving their wire in Pueblo, and that the related context he had mentioned was not vague familiarity but specific prior investigation. He had been building a file on Western Horizon Land Associates for 4 months, sparked by a land dispute in a valley 2 counties over that had the same structural fingerprints. He had been waiting for the documentation. They had given him the documentation. Ferris, the Denver lawyer, objected 14 times in the first hour. Morse overruled him 11 times, sustained him twice on procedural grounds that were accurate but immaterial, and on the 14th objection, looked at Ferris with an expression of polite, complete finality, and said, "Counselor, if you object again to the admission of a signed document from a county official, I will begin to wonder about the nature of your client's relationship with signed documents generally. Do you take my meaning?" Ferris sat down. Caldwell beside him went through 3 different versions of his public face in the space of an hour. Confident, then carefully controlled, then something that was trying very hard not to be afraid and not entirely succeeding. When Mitchell took the stand and presented his statement and the contract with Pratt's signature, Caldwell's jaw tightened so visibly that Clara saw Mrs. Stokes sitting beside her press her lips together to keep from saying something. When the ledger page from Haverford's tin box was entered into evidence, the WHLA payments to EP quarterly timed precisely with each ruling. Caldwell leaned toward Ferris and said something in a very low voice. Ferris shook his head. Caldwell said something else. Ferris shook his head again more definitively. Whatever move Caldwell had been hoping to make his own lawyer was telling him it was too late. At 11:30, Judge Morse set down the last document, removed his glasses, and looked at the room. "I'm going to make several findings this morning," he said. "I'll state them plainly, and the record will reflect the specifics." The room was absolutely silent. First, the land claim filed through Western Horizon Land Associates against the Red Hollow Schoolhouse property is hereby invalidated on grounds of assessor conflict of interest and procedural corruption. The property reverts to Community Educational Trust, pending a properly convened board of trustees with no conflicted members. Clara did not make a sound. She pressed her hands flat on her knees the way she had on the depot platform 3 weeks ago. But this time, it was not to hold herself together. It was to hold herself still. Second, damage settlement, paid by Elias Boone to Harvey Caldwell. 7 months ago, approved by County Assessor Pratt, is found to have been processed through a compromised official process and is ordered reversed. The amount will be returned in full within 30 days. She heard Elias exhale beside her. Just once. Very quietly. Third, I am referring the matter of County Assessor Pratt's conduct to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation of bribery and official corruption. The same referral will be made regarding County Clerk Edelman. He paused. The broader question of Western Horizon Land Associates' activity in this territory will be included in that referral. He put his glasses back on. As for Mr. Caldwell, he looked at Caldwell directly. The conduct documented in these proceedings represents the most calculated campaign of community fraud I have seen in 20 years on this bench. The referral to the Attorney General will include specific findings regarding coercion, financial manipulation, and conspiracy to corrupt public officials. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I would strongly recommend that you consult with counsel regarding your options. Good counsel. He looked at Ferris. Different counsel, perhaps. Ferris was already closing his briefcase. Caldwell sat very still. The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the particular sound of a community that has been holding its breath for a long time and has suddenly been given permission to breathe. Voices all at once, Mrs. Stokes reaching over and gripping Clara's arm so hard it would leave a mark she wouldn't notice until the next morning. Pete Garland turning to his son with an expression that was equal parts relief and vindication. Cord pumping his fist once with the uninhibited joy of a 20-year-old who has just watched the right side win. Sheriff Pryor walked past Caldwell's table toward the door and stopped beside it, just long enough to say very quietly, "Mr. Caldwell, I'll need you to remain available." Caldwell said nothing. He looked for the first time in as long as anyone in Red Hollow had probably seen like a man who had run out of options and knew it. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, with the whole community spilling out around her, and voices overlapping, and children running, and Mrs. Stokes already organizing people into what sounded very much like a preliminary school committee meeting, scheduled for the following Monday, Clara stood very still in the middle of all of it. She was not distant. She was not removed. She was completely present. She could feel every voice, and every handshake, and every face turning toward her, with the particular warmth of people who have found their courage again, and are grateful to the person who helped them find it. But for just a moment, she let herself be still inside it. She thought about the depot platform. 3 weeks ago. The dog that had looked at her and walked away. The oil lamps coming on one by one in the cold. The $11.40 and the worthless letter, and the complete and devastating conviction that she had made the worst mistake of her life. She thought about her mother's shelf of books and what it meant to hand someone a key. She had handed this town a key. No, she corrected herself. She had shown them the key was already in their hands. They had just forgotten they were holding it. Elias appeared beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there in the way he had of being present without demanding anything from the presence. And she felt the particular quality of comfort that comes from standing next to a person who has earned the right to be in your story. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she said. He looked at the crowd around them. At Mrs. Stokes already in full organizational mode. At Mitchell standing slightly apart with the expression of a man who has just set down something very heavy and is still adjusting to the change in weight. At Cord, who had somehow acquired a slice of pie from somewhere and was eating it with complete satisfaction on the courthouse steps. "It worked," Elias said. "It worked," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I said last night there were things I wanted to say after today." She looked at him. "I know." "Oh," she said. "I meant them." "I know that too." He turned to look at her directly. The courthouse noise went on around them. All those voices, all that community, finding itself again. But between the two of them, there was a quality of stillness that had nothing to do with quiet. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "And I'm not a man who says things twice. So I'll say this once, and let you do with it whatever you want." He held her gaze steadily. "I would very much like it if you stayed in Red Hollow." Not because the school needs a teacher, though it does. Not because the ranch needs a bookkeeper, though that's still true. But because... He paused. For the first time since she had known him, she saw him choose his words with something that was close to uncertainty. Because I have been alone for a long time, and I did not know what I was missing until you sat down at my kitchen table and started reading ledgers, like the answers to everything were in there somewhere. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Missouri, about the boarding house room she had left, about Thomas Hargrove's face in that parlor with no shame on it at all, about the version of herself that had stepped off the train 3 weeks ago, certain she was lost. She had not been lost. She had been somewhere she hadn't discovered herself yet. The school needs a teacher, she said. He waited. And the ranch needs a bookkeeper. Yes, and you need someone who will argue with you when you're wrong, which I suspect is not often, but does occasionally happen. Something shifted in his face, that almost smile becoming finally actual. I can confirm it happens occasionally. She looked at him. At this honest man in his honest coat with his honest eyes and his 4 miles north ranch that was entirely his and would remain entirely his because they had fought for it together and won. I'll stay, she said. He nodded. Once. The way he did everything simply completely without unnecessary flourish. Then he offered her his arm, the way a person offers something they mean. And she took it the way a person takes something they've decided they deserve. 6 months later, the Red Hollow schoolhouse reopened. The community had repaired it themselves, new roof boards, fresh whitewashing, a bell, rehung in the steeple that the Reverend said could be heard clear to the north pasture on a quiet morning. Every family in the valley had contributed something. Labor materials time. The kind of collective effort that only happens when people have remembered that they belong to one another. Mitchell had returned to Colorado Springs to care for his mother, but he had testified fully before the Territorial Attorney General, and his name appeared in the official record as the person whose preserved documentation had been essential to the prosecution. Caldwell and Pratt were both facing formal charges. Edelman had resigned his position before charges could be filed, which fooled no one. The Western Horizon case had expanded into 4 counties and was now a territorial matter that had made the Denver papers twice. Mrs. Stokes was chair of the newly reconstituted school committee, a role she had accepted with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting for it for approximately a decade. Sheriff Pryor had arrested no one in Red Hollow for 3 weeks running, which he said was some kind of record. Cord had gotten a raise which Elias had decided on without being asked, and which Clara thought was entirely appropriate. On the morning of the reopening, before the families arrived, and before the children came running across the field, with the particular energy of children released into something new, Clara stood alone in the schoolroom and looked at the rows of empty desks and the clean board at the front and the windows full of October light. She thought about her mother reading by lamplight until she fell asleep mid-sentence. She thought about keys and what they open. She pressed her hand flat against one of the desk surfaces worn smooth by years of previous children's arms, and she felt in the simple solidity of it everything that had led to this moment. Every hard thing. Every right choice made in spite of being afraid. Every person who had stood beside her. Elias appeared in the doorway. He looked at her hand on the desk, at her face, at the room around her, and he understood all of it without her having to say a word because that was who he was. Ready, he said. She straightened, turned to face the door, took one last look at the room that was about to fill with the thing she had always been meant to put in it. Yes, she said. She walked out into the morning. The first children were already running across the field, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived at a depot with nothing but a worthless letter and $11.40, and the stubborn, unbreakable conviction that she was not done yet, walked down the schoolhouse steps to meet them. She had not been saved by this town. She had not been rescued by an honest man's kindness. She had saved herself with her own hands, her own mind, her own refusal to accept that a door closing meant there was no door left. Everything else, the ranch, the man, the community, that now turned to her when they needed hope. Everything else was what grew in the ground she had refused to abandon. She had come west looking for a beginning. It turned out the beginning had been waiting for her all along inside the hardest moment she had ever survived. And she had survived it. Completely. Permanently. Hers.